Night rests heavily against the slope, not dramatic, not sudden, but complete. Snow lies where it has settled, pressed thin by wind, hardened by cold, shaped by time more than movement. The mountain does not announce itself. It simply remains, large enough to absorb sound, old enough to ignore it. Before you drift off, if you wish to continue watching, not as a participant, but as a patient observer of how endurance takes shape, take a moment to subscribe. And if you'd like, let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. Somewhere along its lower shoulder, boots move without rhythm. Not marching, not advancing, only continuing. The men are spread thin along the incline, shapes dark against paler ground, each step placed carefully, not for speed, but to avoid slipping backward. Breath rises and fades, barely visible, taken and released without comment. Metal touches fabric. Fabric touches skin. The weight carried is familiar now, not counted, not questioned, only adjusted when it shifts. Rifles knock softly against packs. Straps creak. Snow compresses underfoot with a sound that is more felt than heard. Nothing here echoes. The mountain keeps what reaches it. You watch from a distance that offers no advantage. There is no overview, no clean line of sight, only fragments. A shoulder turning, a gloved hand steadying itself against rock, the brief pause when someone stops to let another pass. Faces are mostly hidden, angled downward, turned away from the wind. What matters is not who they are, but that they keep moving. The air grows thinner without warning. Not enough to stop breathing, only enough to make it deliberate. Each inhale is taken fully, each exhale longer than before. The body notices first. The mind follows more slowly. There is no signal for this change, no marker in the snow to say when the mountain began asking more. Light exists only as reflection. Moonlight touches ridges and disappears into folds of terrain. Shadows overlap and erase one another. Time loosens here. Minutes pass without shape. Hours do not announce themselves. The night does not deepen. It simply holds. This is not the beginning. It only feels like one. The men have already been walking for days, but that knowledge carries no weight here. What exists now is the next step, the ground immediately ahead, the sound of breathing inside wool and fabric and frost. Memory is kept close, but not visited. There is no space for it. The mountain offers no direction. There is no path, only a general upward pull, guided by maps consulted earlier, by orders received somewhere far below, in a place where air was thicker and decisions easier to pronounce. Up here, instruction becomes interpretation. Movement becomes agreement between body and terrain. You notice how quiet endurance sounds. Not heroic, not strained, just persistent. The absence of voices is not discipline. It is economy. Words would cost warmth. They would cost breath. Silence is not chosen. It is necessary. Snow begins again, lightly at first, almost polite. Small flakes settle on sleeves and shoulders, melt briefly, then freeze. Nothing changes immediately. Nothing ever does. The mountain does not hurry. Neither do the men, though they know they cannot stop. This moment does not ask to be remembered. It asks only to be endured. The climb continues without announcement. There is no signal to mark progress, no clear separation between effort already spent and effort still required. The mountain offers no reassurance. It neither resists nor yields. It simply exists, and in existing, demands adaptation. Fingers stiffen first. The cold moves inward slowly, not as pain, but as dulling. Buckles are harder to release. Straps resist being tightened. Tasks that once took seconds now require attention. A glove slips, is retrieved, shaken free of snow, pulled back on. Nothing about this moment feels decisive. It feels procedural, as though endurance itself has become a routine. Somewhere farther down the line, someone pauses longer than expected. Not from collapse. Just a recalibration. The men behind wait without comment. Waiting here is not rest. It is exposure. Wind presses through seams in fabric. Snow finds openings that were not noticed before. Still, the line holds. Movement resumes. You sense how the mountain reshapes time. The past grows indistinct, the future abstract. What remains is the present measured in breath and balance. Each step confirms only that the last one was successful. Nothing more is promised. This is not a story about conquest. It is not even about progress. It is about remaining upright when the ground refuses to help, about continuing when nothing around you acknowledges the effort. The mountain does not observe them. It does not judge. It simply demands consistency. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the war continues in its usual ways. Maps changing hands, messages crossing wires, decisions made in rooms with heat and light. Up here, those abstractions thin out, replaced by texture and weight and air. Strategy dissolves into movement. Orders become distance. You remain a witness, watching the line stretch and compress as the slope shifts. The men are not named. They do not need to be. Their identity is momentary, defined by position and motion rather than rank or history. What binds them now is not ideology or destination, but the shared agreement to keep going. This channel exists to observe moments like this, not for their outcome, but for their duration. For the quiet spaces where history does not announce itself, where survival unfolds without witnesses, and meaning arrives later, if at all. Morning does not arrive so much as it thins the night. The dark loosens its hold gradually, releasing shape and distance in small concessions. Snow becomes visible before the sky does. Rock edges sharpen. The line of men resolves from silhouettes into bodies again, still bent forward, still moving. The mountain has changed overnight, though nothing dramatic has occurred. Wind has shifted snow into new drifts, erased yesterday's footprints, filled shallow depressions and exposed others. Familiar ground is no longer recognizable. The slope looks the same, but it behaves differently. Steps that once held now slide. Places that seemed stable give way without warning. Cold has settled deeper. It is no longer an external condition, but a presence carried inside clothing and muscle. Joints move less freely. Fingers do not fully obey. Adjustments are made automatically. Packs shifted higher, scarves pulled tighter, heads lowered into collars. These gestures are not reactions. They are habits learned through repetition. You notice how the men measure distance now. Not in miles or elevation, but in effort. One rise at a time. One narrow traverse. One exposed stretch of rock where footing must be tested before weight is committed. The mountain offers no rhythm. It interrupts, demands pauses, then permits movement again. Sound returns slowly with the light. Wind moves across the slope, not as a gust but as a constant pressure. Snow brushes against fabric. Boots scrape stone. Breath becomes audible again, uneven, slightly forced. There is no conversation. Words would break the careful accounting of breath and balance. Somewhere along the column, a man stumbles. Not a fall, just a momentary loss of alignment. He catches himself with a gloved hand pressed into snow, waits for his footing to return, then straightens. No one reacts. This is not indifference. It is efficiency. Everyone understands the calculation. Assistance would slow the line. Delay would cost warmth. The mountain accepts no excess. Every movement must justify itself. Every pause must serve recovery or safety. Standing still too long invites the cold to settle deeper. Moving too fast invites exhaustion. The correct pace exists only briefly, and it shifts constantly. You watch how the slope narrows. The line compresses. Men move closer together, not for comfort, but because the terrain allows nothing else. A misstep here would not mean injury alone. It would mean disappearance, a slide downward, uncontrolled, silent. Awareness sharpens without becoming fear. Fear would waste energy. Light strengthens, but the sun does not warm. It reflects instead, turning snow into a surface that strains the eyes. Lenses frost. Goggles are adjusted. Heads tilt slightly downward to reduce glare. The mountain asks for adaptation in small increments, each one necessary, none sufficient on its own. This environment does not respond to intention. Strength does not impress it. Courage does not alter it. The mountain responds only to physics, weight, friction, temperature, time. The men adjust accordingly, learning not to fight, but to negotiate. You sense how the land begins to dictate posture. Backs curve. Shoulders rise against the cold. Necks tuck forward. Over hours, the mountain shapes the body into something suited to endurance rather than speed. Movement becomes economical. Nothing is wasted. The march continues upward, though upward has lost meaning. Direction is no longer a line on a map. It is simply the path that allows continued movement. The mountain decides that path moment by moment. No one names this place. No marker records their passage. Snow closes behind them almost immediately. The mountain does not remember. As the light settles into full morning, the mountain reveals more without offering relief. What becomes visible is not ease, but scale. Ridges extend farther than expected. Slopes connect to other slopes, each one folding into the next. The path ahead exists, but it does not shorten. The men move into a stretch where the wind no longer schemes but presses. It slides along the contour of the land, steady and cold, finding every opening in fabric and gear. Snow lifts from the surface and drifts sideways, blurring depth and distance. The horizon dissolves into motion. Orientation becomes instinctive rather than visual. Here, the mountain begins to teach restraint. Steps are smaller. Weight shifts are slower. Momentum is avoided. A hurried movement would invite imbalance. Each man learns this individually, then unconsciously synchronizes with the pace around him. The line adjusts without command. No order is spoken. The terrain has already issued it. You observe how the cold alters attention. Sensation dulls at the edges, but awareness sharpens at the center. Pain is not sharp enough to distract. It is broad, manageable, constant. The body accepts it as a condition rather than a signal. What matters is function. Hands must still grip. Legs must still lift. Breathing must remain controlled. The mountain narrows again, forcing the men into single file along a ledge where snow thins to ice. Boots scrape carefully. Each step is tested before weight follows. A hand touches rock for balance, then withdraws quickly, as if contact itself carries risk. No one looks down. The space below is understood without being examined. Time stretches in this place. A few hundred meters take an hour. The mind releases the idea of arrival. There is no benefit in imagining what comes next. Endurance is anchored in the immediate. The mountain allows nothing else. Somewhere in the line, a pack is adjusted again. The weight has not changed, but the body carrying it has. Muscles tire unevenly. Shoulders burn, then go numb. The adjustment brings momentary relief, but also reminds the man that relief will be temporary. This knowledge does not discourage him. It informs him. You notice how the environment erases individuality. Helmets, hoods, and scarves reduce faces to partial shapes. Names lose relevance. What remains is motion, a sequence of bodies maintaining spacing, maintaining balance, maintaining progress. The mountain interacts with the group, not the individual. The sky clears slightly. Blue appears through thinning cloud. The light sharpens edges, but offers no warmth. Snow reflects it mercilessly. Eyes squint. Heads lower. The mountain grants clarity without comfort. There is no celebration when a small rise is crested. Another reveals itself immediately beyond. Elevation gained is not acknowledged. To acknowledge it would be to notice how much remains. Wind carries sound strangely here. A scrape echoes briefly, then vanishes. Breath seems louder inside fabric than outside it. The men exist within their own narrow spheres of sensation, overlapping just enough to move together. You remain watching, aware that this environment is not exceptional to the mountain. It is ordinary. It has always been this way. The only unusual element is the line of men passing through, adjusting themselves to conditions that will not adjust in return. The mountain continues to accept their presence without response. By the time the slope eases, the change is so gradual it is almost missed. The angle softens. The ground widens. The line stretches slightly as each man allows himself a fraction more space. Nothing is said. The body registers the shift before the mind names it. This is where repetition settles in. Not the dramatic repetition of drills or orders, but the quiet recurrence of motion. Step. Balance. Breathe. Adjust. Step again. The sequence does not vary. It does not need to. What matters is that it continues. Snow thickens underfoot, no longer packed hard by wind. Each step sinks slightly, then releases. The effort increases just enough to be noticed. Muscles respond by tightening, conserving. Knees lift higher. The pace slows by instinct, not decision. Everyone senses the same threshold. You watch how time begins to lose texture. Hours do not distinguish themselves. There is no clear memory of when the last pause occurred. Stops are brief and purposeful. A sip from a canteen, a strap tightened, a glance backward to confirm spacing. Then movement resumes, indistinguishable from before. The mountain no longer dominates attention. It becomes a constant instead of an obstacle. Awareness shifts inward. The body becomes the terrain now, its limits, its warnings, its small negotiations. A foot rubs raw inside a boot. It is noticed, then set aside. There is no alternative. Breathing finds a rhythm that matches movement. Inhale over 2 steps. Exhale over 3. This pattern holds until it doesn't, then reforms slightly altered. The body experiments quietly, searching for efficiency. Thought stays shallow. Depth would invite fatigue. You notice how the men stop looking around. Vision narrows to what is immediately useful. The slope ahead. The boots in front. The placement of the next step. Peripheral detail fades. The mountain recedes not because it has become easier, but because attention has become selective. A halt is called without words. The line compresses gently. Packs are lowered carefully, not dropped. Knees bend slowly. Standing still feels strange now, almost disruptive. Cold presses inward immediately, reclaiming space. Hands move to pockets, armpits, any place where warmth might be borrowed. There is no conversation during the pause. Silence preserves energy. Each man occupies his own narrow circle of awareness, checking fingers, toes, breath. The pause lasts only as long as it must. Long enough to prevent collapse. Short enough to avoid stiffness. When movement resumes, it does so reluctantly. Muscles protest the transition. Joints creak. The first steps feel heavier than those before the stop. This is understood. No one resents it. Repetition has taught them what to expect. The line reforms. Spacing returns. The pattern continues. You sense how endurance shifts from effort to management. Survival is no longer about pushing forward, but about not wasting what remains. Every action is weighed, not consciously, but through habit refined by hours of movement. The mountain watches without comment as the men become quieter, more economical, more alike. As the hours accumulate, repetition deepens rather than dulls. What began as conscious pacing becomes instinctive. The body no longer asks permission to continue. It simply does. Fatigue is present, but it no longer announces itself loudly. It spreads evenly, like a weight distributed across every movement. The men pass through the same motions again and again, yet no two moments feel identical. Snow density shifts. Wind presses harder, then loosens. The slope rises gently, then levels. Each variation requires adjustment, small and precise. Endurance is not stubbornness here. It is attentiveness. You notice how memory behaves under repetition. Earlier efforts blur together. The first hours of the march feel distant, as if they belong to another day entirely. What remains clear is the immediate past, the last pause, the last adjustment, the last stretch where footing was uncertain. Memory shortens itself to preserve focus. The body begins to ration sensation. Pain does not vanish, but it stops demanding attention. It becomes a background condition, like the cold or the altitude. What breaks through instead are changes. A boot that feels looser, a strap that rubs differently, breath that catches unexpectedly. These signals are noted, addressed if possible, then folded back into the ongoing rhythm. Movement resumes after another brief halt. Packs rise again, heavier than before not because they have gained weight, but because the men have lost reserve. Shoulders dip forward instinctively, redistributing load. Spines curve further. The posture of endurance settles in. You watch how repetition reshapes thought. There is no space for speculation. Questions about distance, destination, or outcome dissolve before they fully form. The mind learns what the mountain has already enforced, that only the next sequence matters. Step. Balance. Breathe. Snow begins to fall again, finer this time, drifting rather than striking. It collects on sleeves and helmets, adding weight so slight it would be ignored under other conditions. Here, it is noticed. A hand brushes snow away. The gesture repeats often enough to become automatic. Small efforts accumulate. Nothing is free. The line stretches and compresses with the terrain, but its cohesion holds. No one drifts far ahead. No one falls behind without being noticed. This is not camaraderie in the sentimental sense. It is mutual dependence shaped by necessity. Spacing preserves safety. Awareness preserves continuity. You sense how endurance becomes shared without being discussed. Each man carries his own fatigue, but the rhythm belongs to all of them. To break it would be to endanger more than oneself. The pace becomes a quiet agreement, renewed with every step. Time passes without markers. The sky shifts subtly, light flattening as cloud thickens again. There is no sense of afternoon or evening, only accumulation. Fatigue layers itself gently, evenly, until it feels permanent. Still, the march continues. The mountain offers no commentary on their persistence. It neither rewards nor resists. It simply remains, as it always has, allowing passage only at the cost of repetition. You remain watching as endurance settles fully into place, not as struggle, but as routine. Orders exist somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the cloud, beyond the thin air that presses against the lungs. They were spoken earlier, written earlier, decided earlier, in rooms where breath came easily and time moved in segments that could be measured. Up here, those orders arrive already worn thin by distance. The men do not question them. There is nothing to question against. The instruction is simple enough to survive the climb. Continue. Direction remains general, reinforced by maps consulted long ago, by compass bearings checked when fingers still moved freely. Precision fades as conditions tighten. Interpretation replaces certainty. You notice how isolation settles in quietly. Not loneliness, but separation. The sense that what is happening here is occurring beyond observation. No signal reaches outward from this slope. No message travels quickly enough to matter. The men move within a narrowing circle of awareness, bounded by terrain and weather. Communication within the line reduces to gesture and glance. A raised hand. A pause held slightly longer than expected. These signals are understood without explanation. They carry no emotion. They are functional, refined by necessity. The mountain interferes with sound as much as with movement. Wind pulls words apart before they can travel. Snow absorbs what remains. Even if voices were raised, they would not carry. Silence is not discipline here. It is enforced. You sense how command distance reshapes responsibility. Decisions that once belonged to others now emerge locally, quietly. Pace is adjusted without request. Routes are chosen without consultation. These choices are not framed as leadership. They are framed as survival. The line reaches a point where the planned path narrows into uncertainty. Snow has filled what the map suggested would be passable. Ice glints where rock was expected. The men slow further, not from hesitation, but from recalculation. The mountain has revised the plan. A brief halt. Compasses appear, then disappear. Bearings are checked against terrain that does not fully match expectation. No frustration surfaces. Frustration would consume energy. Instead, acceptance settles in. This is what distance does. It alters intention. You watch as the route shifts subtly, angling toward a line of trees half buried in snow. Shelter is not guaranteed there, but variation is. The decision is unspoken, shared through movement rather than instruction. One man alters course slightly. The others follow. This is where command becomes presence rather than authority. Those who move first do so not because of rank, but because someone must test the ground. Responsibility circulates without being named. It settles briefly, then passes on. The men know that somewhere behind them, decisions are still being made about their progress. Reports may be expected. Timelines imagined. None of that reaches this slope in real time. What reaches it instead is wind, cold, and the simple fact of distance. You remain observing as isolation takes on shape, not dramatic, not despairing, but absolute. The mountain has absorbed the line into itself, separating it from everything that lies beyond. Movement resumes, altered but steady. As the route settles into its revised course, the sense of distance deepens. Not in miles, but in consequence. Each choice now carries more weight because it cannot be quickly corrected. A wrong turn would not be reported. It would simply be lived with. The men move through a stretch where the mountain closes in again, trees thinning to bare trunks and then vanishing altogether. What remains is open slope and sky pressed low by cloud. The absence of landmarks makes progress feel abstract. Direction is held in the body rather than the eye. You notice how authority becomes diffuse. No voice claims it. No gesture announces it. Decisions occur through alignment rather than instruction. When one man slows to test the snow ahead, the line responds. When another adjusts course to avoid exposed ice, the rest follow. Leadership here is momentary and situational. The distance from command is not resented. There is no energy for that. Instead, it becomes a condition to be managed, like cold or fatigue. Expectations are simplified. The task narrows further. Remain oriented, remain upright, remain together. The mountain complicates every attempt at communication. Even eye contact becomes difficult when goggles frost and faces turn inward against the wind. Awareness shifts again, becoming collective rather than individual. Each man watches the movement of the one ahead, trusting that observation more than any remembered instruction. Time behaves differently under isolation. Without messages or signals from beyond the ridge, the march loses its place within a larger sequence. There is no sense of being late or early, only the sense of being present, moving within a sealed pocket of experience. A pause occurs where the slope steepens unexpectedly. The men cluster closer, drawn together by necessity rather than comfort. The wind presses harder here, funneling between ridges. Snow lifts in sheets, obscuring depth. The decision to continue is not debated. It is enacted. You sense how responsibility compresses inward. Each man becomes accountable not only for himself, but for the continuity of the line. A misjudged step would ripple outward. Awareness sharpens accordingly. Fatigue is acknowledged, then set aside. Maps are no longer consulted, not because they are useless, but because they cannot keep pace with conditions. Knowledge now comes from texture and resistance, the sound of snow underfoot, the way ice reflects light, the angle at which the wind strikes the body. The mountain does not distinguish between intention and error. It responds only to action. This reality reshapes decision-making into something quieter, more conservative. Risks are minimized not through caution alone, but through shared understanding. You remain watching as the men continue forward, carrying with them not only their equipment, but the growing weight of autonomy. Distance from command has not freed them. It has simply transferred responsibility into their hands, one step at a time. The line holds. Fatigue does not arrive all at once. It settles gradually, almost politely, spreading itself thin so it will not be noticed. By the time it becomes undeniable, it has already reshaped posture, breath, and judgment. The men move now with a slight forward lean that was not there before. Packs sit heavier against curved backs. Knees lift just enough to clear snow, no higher. Every motion has been trimmed of excess. Efficiency is no longer a strategy. It is the only option. You notice how choices begin to narrow. Where earlier there were several ways to move through a section of ground, now there are fewer. Not because the terrain has changed, but because the body's tolerance has. A steeper route is dismissed without discussion. A longer, safer traverse is accepted, even though it will extend the day. The mountain does not object. It simply records the decision in distance. A man near the center of the line slows slightly. Not enough to stop the column, only enough to be noticed. The man behind adjusts his pace to match. This adjustment passes backward, subtle but real. No one speaks. No one points. The line absorbs the change. This is where moral pressure begins to take shape. Not as crisis, but as accumulation. Each man becomes aware, dimly at first, that his own endurance affects more than himself. Speed is no longer personal. Stopping is no longer private. You observe how help is offered without ceremony. A hand steadies a shoulder on a steep pitch. A pack strap is tightened by someone else's fingers when numbness interferes. These gestures are brief, efficient, and unacknowledged. Gratitude would cost breath. Explanation would cost time. Cold returns aggressively during pauses now. It fills the space created by stillness almost immediately. The men learn to keep stops shorter, even when rest would help. The calculation shifts. Less recovery, more movement. The body protests quietly. It is ignored just enough. Snow thickens again, and with it the effort required to move. Each step compresses, sinks, releases. Calves burn steadily. Thighs ache without sharpness. The pain has no edge. It is simply there, constant, shared. You sense how endurance begins to press against values. Decisions that once would have felt harsh now feel practical. Pace is maintained even when it costs comfort. The idea of stopping for one man becomes inseparable from the risk to all. Responsibility tightens. The mountain does not accelerate this process. It does not force it. It merely allows it to unfold. Pressure accumulates naturally when resources diminish. The men continue upward, carrying not only weight and fatigue, but the quiet awareness that every choice now has consequences beyond the individual. As fatigue deepens, it alters judgment in subtle ways. Not recklessly, not dramatically. It narrows options until only the most workable remain. What once might have been debated is now accepted without hesitation. The body has already decided before the mind formulates a reason. The line moves more slowly now, though no one names the change. The mountain does not demand speed, only persistence. Each man senses the limits of his own endurance and adjusts just enough to stay within them. To exceed them would risk collapse. To fall behind would endanger others. The balance is held carefully, moment by moment. You watch as small decisions accumulate into moral weight. When someone stumbles, the pause that follows is shorter than it once would have been. Not from indifference, but from necessity. Stopping too long would drain warmth from everyone. Helping must be quick, efficient, almost impersonal. Hands move automatically. A grip is offered. A strap is lifted. A body is steadied just long enough for movement to resume. There is no discussion of fairness. No time to consider alternatives. Survival has compressed values into function. The cold presses harder now, finding the fatigue in muscle and bone. Shivering appears during brief pauses, then disappears with motion. The men learn to distrust stillness. Movement becomes not just progress, but protection. You sense how responsibility reshapes relationships. Each man becomes acutely aware of his position in the line. Too fast, and he strains those behind him. Too slow, and he invites danger. The pace becomes a shared ethical agreement, renewed continuously without words. Snow begins to fall more heavily, thickening the air and softening edges. Visibility shortens. Depth perception falters. The mountain withdraws its clarity just as the men need it most. Decisions must be made with less information than before. A steeper section demands a choice. The direct route promises shorter distance but greater risk. The longer traverse offers safety at the cost of time and energy. The decision is made through movement rather than speech. The line angles outward, accepting delay in exchange for stability. You notice how this choice reflects a shift. Earlier, speed might have been prioritized. Now, preservation outweighs momentum. The march is no longer about reaching a point quickly. It is about ensuring that reaching it remains possible at all. Fatigue does not inspire reflection. It enforces pragmatism. The men do not think in terms of sacrifice. They think in terms of continuity. Whatever allows the line to keep moving is chosen. The mountain remains unchanged by these calculations. It offers no indication of approval or consequence. It simply receives the line as it passes, indifferent to the moral compression taking place within it. You remain watching as endurance transforms from effort into obligation, not imposed from above, but generated quietly among the men themselves. The weather turns without warning, not violently, but decisively. Snow thickens, then flattens, driven sideways by wind that no longer flows around the men but through them. Visibility collapses into a narrow tunnel of motion, the world reduced to the slope beneath their boots and the vague outline of the body ahead. The mountain removes distance first. What lies beyond a few meters no longer matters, because it cannot be seen. Progress becomes tactile rather than visual. Snow is tested with each step. Ice announces itself through resistance and sound. The men learn to trust texture more than sight. You notice how uncertainty settles in as a constant companion. Not fear. Fear would be sharp, consuming, but a dull awareness that the margin for error has thinned further. Every decision carries increased consequence simply because fewer variables can be observed. The line tightens instinctively. Spacing decreases. The men draw closer, not for warmth or reassurance, but to preserve continuity. Losing sight of the man ahead now carries real risk. The column becomes a single, extended organism, moving cautiously through white space. Breathing changes again. Cold air stings the lungs. Inhalations are shorter, more controlled. Exhalations fog goggles and collars. Moisture freezes quickly, adding weight and stiffness to fabric. The body works harder to maintain the same output. A pause occurs where the slope steepens into something less predictable. Snow drifts hide uneven ground. A probing foot sinks deeper than expected. Balance is recovered slowly, carefully. The pause extends just long enough to assess, then movement resumes. You sense how fatigue amplifies uncertainty. Decisions that would have been simple hours earlier now require more attention. The men compensate by slowing further, conserving not only energy, but clarity. Speed would invite mistakes. The mountain offers no cues. Landmarks vanish. Direction must be held internally, guided by compass checks performed with stiff fingers, by remembered bearings that now feel abstract. The path exists only because it is being made. You remain watching as the environment closes in, not with drama, but with quiet insistence. The march continues, altered but unbroken, as endurance enters a more fragile phase. As the storm settles fully into place, it removes the last sense of scale. Up and down lose distinction. The slope feels endless because there is no reference by which to measure change. The men move through a space that offers no reassurance that progress is being made at all. Snow presses against faces and collars, driven by wind that never quite peaks, never quite eases. It remains constant, wearing rather than striking. Sound is muted further. Even the scrape of boots seems distant, as if absorbed before it can register. You notice how attention narrows to survival mechanics. Hands must stay functional. Feet must stay aligned. Breathing must remain controlled. Everything else becomes irrelevant. Thought shortens itself, shedding anything that does not serve immediate continuity. The line advances by trust now. Trust that the man ahead has chosen a viable step. Trust that the man behind will match it. This trust is not emotional. It is procedural, built through hours of shared movement and reinforced with every successful placement of weight. A man near the front pauses longer than expected. The reason is not visible. The men behind wait, pressed close by wind and snow. The pause stretches. Cold pushes inward aggressively. Muscles begin to stiffen. Still, no one speaks. Sound would not travel. Explanation would change nothing. Movement resumes with a slight alteration of course. The adjustment is accepted instantly. In these conditions, hesitation would be riskier than commitment. The mountain has removed the luxury of certainty. You sense how endurance has entered a more brittle state. Not breaking, but vulnerable. Mistakes would carry more consequence now than at any earlier point. Awareness sharpens accordingly, even as fatigue deepens. The men move through the storm as though through resistance itself, each step negotiated, each balance checked. There is no sense of urgency. Urgency would invite error. There is only continuation. Somewhere within the white, time slips further out of reach. The memory of clear light feels unreal. The idea of shelter becomes abstract. What exists is motion, and the fragile thread of cohesion holding the line together. You remain watching as the mountain presses its advantage, not through force, but through persistence, and as the men respond in kind, answering endurance with endurance alone. The storm does not intensify. It stabilizes. This, too, is a condition the mountain enforces. Not escalation, but duration. Snow continues to fall at the same measured rate. Wind holds its direction. Cold remains constant. Nothing changes enough to signal relief or danger. The environment becomes fixed. This is where normalization begins. The men stop waiting for the weather to improve. That expectation quietly dissolves, replaced by the understanding that these conditions are now the baseline. Movement adjusts accordingly. Hoods remain up. Goggles stay frosted. Snow is brushed away without irritation. What would once have drawn comment is now absorbed without remark. You notice how the body adapts to permanence. Muscles find a narrower range of motion that minimizes strain. Breathing becomes shallow but efficient. Shivering disappears during movement, not because warmth has returned, but because energy has been conserved more precisely. The line advances through terrain that no longer registers as hostile, not because it has become easier, but because resistance has become familiar. The mountain loses its sharpness as an adversary and becomes instead a constant pressure, something to be carried rather than overcome. Pauses occur only when unavoidable. When they do, they are shorter than before. The men no longer linger to adjust equipment unless something has failed outright. Minor discomforts are ignored. A strap rubs raw skin. A boot pinches. These sensations are acknowledged, then set aside. Attention is reserved for failures that would halt movement entirely. You sense how endurance shifts again. Earlier, it required conscious effort. Now, it operates automatically. The body continues because stopping has become unthinkable. Not forbidden, simply impractical. The storm reduces visibility to sameness. Every direction looks identical. The idea of being lost loses meaning when all reference points have vanished. Orientation is maintained internally, through remembered bearings and shared movement. The line trusts itself more than the land. There is a quiet moment where someone drops a piece of equipment. It disappears instantly into snow. No one searches for it. The loss is registered without comment. Carrying less will make movement easier. The decision does not feel like sacrifice. It feels like adjustment. You remain observing as normalization takes hold, not as acceptance of hardship, but as the steady recalibration of what is considered manageable. The march continues, unchanged and unremarked. As normalization deepens, the storm loses its identity as an event. It becomes a condition, no longer something that interrupts the march, but something the march passes through continuously. Snowfall, wind, cold, these are no longer noticed individually. They are felt collectively, as a single, ongoing resistance. The men move with a steadiness that no longer feels forced. Fatigue remains, but it has settled into the background, spread evenly across the body. What once demanded attention now exists as a constant hum. The body has learned what it can expect and adjusts its output accordingly. You observe how expectations shrink. There is no anticipation of rest beyond the next brief halt. No imagining of shelter or warmth. These ideas have not been abandoned, but postponed indefinitely. The mind keeps them distant to preserve focus. Movement becomes almost meditative in its repetition. Step, balance, breathe. Snow compresses, releases. Wind presses, then slides past. The line advances without urgency, without hesitation. Continuity has replaced momentum as the guiding principle. The mountain's presence recedes further, not because it has withdrawn, but because the men have absorbed its demands. Resistance has become routine. The environment no longer feels personal. It is simply there, like gravity. A pause occurs where the slope flattens slightly. Packs are lowered with care. Knees bend slowly. The men do not sit fully. Sitting would invite stiffness. They remain half-standing, half-resting, conserving warmth while allowing muscles to release just enough. You notice how conversation has disappeared entirely. Not even brief remarks. Silence is no longer a choice or a tactic. It is the natural state of the march. Sound feels intrusive, unnecessary. When movement resumes, it does so smoothly, without the earlier resistance of cold joints. The body has learned how to restart itself efficiently. This, too, is adaptation. The storm continues unchanged. The mountain remains indifferent. The men persist, not through effort alone, but through normalization, the quiet acceptance of conditions that will not improve. You remain watching as endurance settles into its most stable form, not struggle, not resistance, but sustained accommodation. When the storm finally begins to thin, it does so without ceremony. The wind loosens its grip first, easing just enough to be noticed. Snowfall lightens, not stopping, but spacing itself out. Visibility expands by degrees rather than distance. Shapes return slowly, like memory. The men do not react immediately. Conditions have shifted before, only to tighten again. Caution holds. Movement continues at the same measured pace, unchanged by the possibility of relief. Endurance does not reverse itself quickly. You notice how the body remains guarded. Shoulders stay raised. Hoods remain pulled tight. The expectation of resistance persists even as it begins to lessen. Adaptation does not disappear simply because conditions improve. It lingers. As the air clears slightly, the mountain's scale reasserts itself. Ridges emerge where before there was only white. Slopes regain contour. The path ahead becomes legible again, though no less demanding. Progress is visible now, but distance still refuses to shorten. Fatigue presents itself differently in clearer air. Without the constant pressure of the storm, the body becomes more aware of what it carries. Weight presses harder. Muscles ache more distinctly. The absence of one strain allows others to surface. You watch as the line stretches again, spacing widening just enough to allow individual pacing. The cohesion holds, but the pressure has eased. Each man adjusts subtly, reclaiming a fraction of autonomy without disrupting the group. A longer pause is taken where the terrain permits it. Packs are lowered fully this time. Knees touch snow. Backs straighten cautiously. Breath deepens. The cold remains, but it feels less aggressive without wind driving it inward. No one speaks during the pause. Speech has not returned with visibility. Silence remains the default. Rest is taken efficiently, without indulgence. The mountain, newly revealed, offers no indication that the hardest part is past. It simply presents itself more clearly. What remains ahead is visible now, not comforting but honest. You remain observing as the march transitions into a new phase, not of relief, but of reckoning, with distance still to be covered and reserves already spent. With the storm receding, the men become visible again as individuals rather than silhouettes. Not in any dramatic way. Faces remain mostly hidden, features dulled by cold and fatigue, but small differences reappear. The way one man favors a knee, the way another keeps his head slightly turned against the wind even now that it has eased. They would later be called the mountain boys. Not here, not now, but afterward, when distance made endurance easier to name. The mountain no longer presses inward. It opens outward instead, revealing distance that had been concealed. Valleys stretch away. Ridges layer themselves into the horizon. What was once compressed into immediate survival expands into scale. This expansion does not bring relief. It brings awareness. You notice how progress is reassessed in light of visibility. What felt like steady movement through the storm now appears smaller when measured against what remains. The distance ahead is not discouraging. It is simply undeniable. The line resumes its earlier spacing, allowing each man to find a pace that suits his remaining strength. This flexibility is not generosity. It is necessity. Uniformity would no longer hold. Endurance has become uneven. Fatigue now reveals itself in posture and rhythm rather than breath. Steps shorten. Pauses lengthen slightly. Movements that were once fluid now require intention. The body has expended its reserve and is operating closer to its limit. You observe how responsibility adjusts once more. Earlier, cohesion required tight spacing. Now, it requires patience. Faster men slow without instruction. Slower men are not urged to hurry. The pace becomes an accommodation rather than an agreement. The mountain offers a narrow passage where rock replaces snow. Boots find firmer purchase. The change is welcomed without comment. Solid ground reduces effort, but it does not restore strength. It merely allows what remains to be used more effectively. Sound returns in small ways. Boots strike stone with a sharper note. Packs shift more audibly. Breath echoes faintly against rock faces. The reappearance of sound feels unfamiliar, almost intrusive, after so long within the storm. You remain watching as endurance enters its final transformation, no longer driven by adaptation to conditions, but by the careful management of what has already been spent. The march continues, quieter now, more exposed, carrying with it the accumulated weight of every step taken so far. The mountain begins to descend before anyone names it as such. The angle softens. The strain on calves eases slightly. Weight shifts forward in a way that feels unfamiliar after so many hours of climbing. The change is subtle, almost suspect, as though the land might withdraw the concession at any moment. The men adjust cautiously. Descending demands a different kind of attention. Knees absorb impact. Balance becomes more delicate. Fatigue, which could be managed on the climb through rhythm and pace, now threatens stability. Each step downward must be placed with care. You notice how the body resists this transition. Muscles conditioned for ascent hesitate when asked to reverse their work. Tendons tighten. Ankles complain. The descent does not feel like relief. It feels like exposure. The mountain reveals more of itself as the slope opens. Snow thins. Rock interrupts the surface more frequently. Patches of ice glint in the returning light. The men read these signs carefully, choosing routes that protect joints already strained. Spacing changes again. Descending requires room. A slip could travel downward quickly, unchecked. The line stretches, allowing each man to negotiate the slope independently while maintaining visual contact. Cohesion adapts without instruction. You watch as the awareness of consequence sharpens. Falling now would not simply halt progress. It would threaten injury at a stage when reserves are already depleted. Every movement is tested twice, once by intention, once by weight. Fatigue announces itself more clearly here. Muscles tremble under load. Knees lock briefly, then release. Pauses occur more often, not for breath, but to steady balance. These pauses are short, deliberate, necessary. The mountain no longer feels indifferent. It feels exacting. Errors that might have been absorbed earlier would now be punished more severely. The men sense this without naming it. Attention tightens. You remain observing as the march enters this final demanding phase, not defined by ascent or storm, but by the careful negotiation of descent while carrying the full accumulation of fatigue forward. As the descent continues, fatigue expresses itself in new ways. Muscles that once pushed now resist. Knees absorb weight they were never meant to carry for so long. Ankles adjust constantly, correcting small imbalances before they become failures. The body works harder now to appear stable. The men move with deliberate caution, each step placed slightly to the side of the one before it, testing snow and stone for reliability. What held firm moments ago may not hold again. The mountain allows no assumptions. You notice how time slows once more, not because of weather or terrain, but because attention has intensified. Every downward movement carries consequence. Speed is sacrificed willingly. Preservation outweighs progress. A slip occurs, brief, contained. A boot skids on ice hidden beneath snow. The man recovers quickly, planting his weight forward, dropping to one knee before standing again. No one reacts beyond a slight pause in the line. The incident is registered, not dramatized. It becomes instruction. The slope eases further, though the ground remains uneven. Snow gives way intermittently to exposed rock, then returns again. Each transition demands adjustment. The men learn to read the surface by sound and resistance rather than sight alone. You sense how endurance now feels fragile, not in danger of collapse, but stripped of excess. What remains is functional, precise, and finite. The men are no longer adapting to new conditions. They are managing the aftermath of all the adaptations already made. The mountain offers glimpses of lower ground, darker patches where snow has thinned, shapes that suggest trees or shelter. These glimpses do not alter pace. Expectation is held in check. Arrival is not assumed. Breathing deepens as altitude eases slightly, but the relief is muted. Lungs fill more easily, yet the body is too tired to celebrate the change. Benefit arrives late, understated. You remain watching as the line continues downward, carrying with it the full memory of the climb in every careful step. The mountain recedes behind them slowly, not released, but gradually relinquished. The first signs of shelter appear without announcement. A change in the way sound behaves. Wind no longer moves cleanly across open slope, but breaks unevenly, caught and redirected. Snow settles differently here, gathering in softer drifts, less scoured, less sharp. The men notice these signs immediately, not consciously. The body recognizes them before the mind assigns meaning. Shoulders lower slightly. Steps lengthen by a fraction. Attention remains tight, but it is no longer stretched to its limit. Trees emerge gradually, not as a boundary, but as presence. Dark trunks interrupt the white, offering contrast and orientation. Branches catch falling snow, reducing what reaches the ground. The mountain begins to feel layered rather than exposed. You watch how movement changes among the trees. The descent slows further, not from difficulty, but from caution. Roots hide beneath snow. Ice clings to shaded ground. The environment offers shelter at the cost of complexity. The line adjusts spacing again. Trees force separation. Each man chooses his own path between trunks, stepping carefully to avoid hidden obstacles. Cohesion becomes visual rather than physical. Awareness extends outward just enough to track movement ahead and behind. Fatigue feels heavier here. Without the constant pressure of wind, the body becomes more aware of its own condition. Muscles ache more distinctly. Joints protest. The effort required to lift a foot over a fallen branch feels disproportionate. The body has little left to give. You notice how pauses lengthen slightly. Packs are lowered more often. Knees bend more slowly. The men allow themselves these moments without guilt. The threat of exposure has lessened. The calculation has changed. The mountain, now partially obscured by trees, no longer dominates the field of view. It becomes background. What matters is footing, direction, continuity. The march narrows into navigation rather than endurance. You remain observing as the environment transitions once more, offering partial relief without resolution. The journey has shifted shape again, but it has not yet concluded. Within the trees, the air feels heavier, slower. Snow falls more quietly here, broken into soft fragments by branches above. Sound behaves differently. Footsteps no longer vanish immediately. They linger, muffled but present, reminding the men of their own movement. Fatigue settles deeper in this space. Without the urgency imposed by open exposure, the body allows itself to acknowledge what it has carried. Shoulders sag. Necks loosen slightly. Breathing deepens, not from ease, but from accumulated need. You notice how attention shifts inward again. Each man becomes more conscious of his own limits. The shared rhythm that held on the slope loosens. Progress becomes uneven, defined by obstacles rather than agreement. Still, no one moves far ahead. No one disappears from view. The trees offer no straight path. Routes twist around trunks and fallen limbs. Snow hides roots that catch at boots unexpectedly. Each misstep costs energy that cannot be easily replaced. Movement becomes cautious again, not from fear, but from conservation. A longer halt is taken where the ground flattens briefly. Packs are lowered fully. Some men sit, backs against trunks, legs extended awkwardly. The cold remains, but it is gentler here, filtered. Hands are tucked under arms. Eyes close briefly, not in sleep, but in relief from vigilance. No one speaks during the halt. Words feel unnecessary. The presence of others is enough. The pause lasts just long enough to risk stiffness, then ends before it can settle fully. When movement resumes, it does so reluctantly. Muscles protest the return to motion. Knees resist bending. Ankles feel unstable. The men accept this without comment. They have learned not to argue with what the body offers. You remain watching as the march continues through the trees. Slower now, heavier, guided less by urgency than by careful persistence. Shelter has arrived, but endurance is not yet finished. The forest thins gradually, not enough to return the men to open ground, but enough to suggest that the mountain's hold is loosening. The slope evens out. The strain on joints eases slightly. Movement becomes less precarious, though no less deliberate. What replaces exposure now is accumulation. Fatigue, long managed and deferred, begins to surface more openly. Shoulders droop. Steps shorten. The careful economy that carried the line upward and downward now feels strained by simple duration. You notice how the men begin to check one another more often, not with concern, not with urgency, but with quiet awareness. A glance held a second longer. A pause that waits until everyone has arrived. These gestures are small, but they mark a shift. Endurance is no longer assumed. It is monitored. The ground underfoot softens, absorbing steps rather than reflecting them. Snow gives way to packed earth and leaf litter beneath. The change feels almost unfamiliar. Feet search for traction where it no longer resists. Balance must be recalibrated once again. A halt is taken where the terrain permits it, longer than those before. Packs come off more heavily now. Arms hang loose at the sides. Some men lean forward with hands on knees, others sit fully, backs rounded. The cold no longer drives them up immediately. The risk has changed. Breathing deepens. Air fills lungs more easily at this lower elevation, but the body is slow to respond. Relief arrives without strength to use it. The men accept this quietly, without frustration. You sense how anticipation begins to return, cautiously, not of comfort, not of rest, but of transition. The mountain is no longer total. Something else lies ahead, though it remains undefined. Movement resumes once more, slower still, guided by habit rather than urgency. The line continues, altered yet intact, carrying the weight of everything that has already passed. As they move forward, the forest opens into wider clearings, the trees stepping back just enough to allow longer lines of sight. Snow thins to scattered patches. Earth shows through, dark and damp, marked by footprints that do not disappear immediately. The ground begins to remember them. Fatigue expresses itself plainly now, not as resistance, but as depletion. Movements slow not because they must be careful, but because there is little left to draw from. Packs feel heavier than they ever did on the climb. Legs respond a moment later than expected. The body works on delay. You notice how endurance has changed character. Earlier, it was active, a constant negotiation with terrain and weather. Now, it is passive, sustained by momentum rather than effort. The men continue because stopping would require more energy than moving on. There is a quiet redistribution of load. One man shifts part of his pack to another without comment. A rifle is carried briefly by someone else, then returned. These exchanges are brief, functional, and unacknowledged. They reflect a shared understanding that the margin is thin. The mountain recedes further behind them, not dramatically, but through absence. The air is still. Wind moves only at ground level. Sound returns more fully, boots on soil, equipment shifting, breath moving freely. These sounds feel unfamiliar after so long within snow and wind. A final halt is taken before the ground levels completely. Packs are lowered carefully, almost reverently. Hands linger on straps before letting go, as if releasing weight requires permission. The men remain standing longer than expected, uncertain how to rest without the constant demand of movement. You sense how the march has ended internally before it has ended physically. The urgency has drained away, replaced by a careful holding of what remains. Arrival is near enough to be assumed, but not close enough to be claimed. Movement resumes once more, quiet and unremarkable. The line proceeds into terrain that no longer tests balance or breath, only patience. Endurance carries them the rest of the way, not through force, but through inertia. The mountain has released them. The ground finally levels without ceremony. There is no boundary, no marker, no clear moment that announces the end. The men step from slope to plain as they have stepped through everything else, cautiously, deliberately, unsure whether the change will hold. The mountain remains behind them, visible now in outline rather than presence. Its ridges no longer dictate posture. Its wind no longer presses breath inward. It stands where it has always stood, unchanged by the passage it permitted. You notice how the body struggles to accept stillness. When movement slows, balance feels uncertain. Muscles that have worked continuously resist stopping. Some men pace a few steps even after the line halts, as though motion itself has become the only stable state. Packs are lowered fully now, not dropped. Set down carefully, as if weight that has been carried for so long deserves respect. Straps are loosened, buckles undone slowly. Hands linger, uncertain what to do without constant task. Silence behaves differently here. It is not enforced by wind or snow. It exists naturally, shaped by exhaustion. No one speaks immediately. There is nothing to say that would add to what has already been endured. Breathing deepens further. Air fills lungs without resistance. The body notices this with surprise, then acceptance. Relief arrives unevenly. Some men feel it immediately. Others feel only the ache left behind. You watch how the march continues in memory even as it ends in reality. Feet shift restlessly. Weight transfers unconsciously. The posture of endurance remains, unwilling to release its hold all at once. The mountain does not close behind them. It does not reclaim the path. Snow will do that later, quietly. For now, the route remains faintly visible, marked by compressed earth and disturbed ground, evidence that passage has occurred. This is not triumph. It is not relief. It is transition, the slow return from a state where survival required constant negotiation to one where stillness becomes possible again. You remain observing as the men stand at the edge of what comes next, carrying with them the imprint of every step taken when nothing was promised beyond continuation. In the hours that follow, the mountain recedes further, not in distance, but in authority. Its demands loosen their grip gradually. Fingers regain sensation. Shoulders settle. The body relearns stillness in fragments, testing it the way it once tested ice and snow. What remains is not memory in the dramatic sense. It is residue, the quiet recalibration of effort. The way weight is still measured before being lifted. The way pauses are taken even when nothing requires them. Endurance does not vanish when the conditions change. It lingers, cautious, slow to trust. You watch as the men begin to separate into smaller movements and tasks, no longer bound by a single line. The cohesion that carried them through exposure loosens naturally. It does not break. It simply reshapes, becoming background rather than structure. The mountain stands unchanged behind them, already reclaiming its surface. Snow drifts settle. Wind smooths edges. Tracks soften. The passage fades almost immediately, as if it were never meant to be preserved. The land keeps no record of who crossed it, or how. What remains is carried elsewhere, in posture, in restraint, in the quiet knowledge of what sustained effort requires when nothing assists it. Not heroism, not conquest, just the ability to continue when conditions refuse to improve. In time, this march will be reduced to lines in reports, to distances measured, to outcomes weighed against cost. But here, in this moment after movement has finally ceased, meaning has not yet formed. It does not need to. Endurance has already done its work. Wind moves gently across the plain. Light shifts. The mountain holds its shape against the sky, indifferent and complete. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.